Good morning, everybody. Our text is Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 20. Luke 15, 11 through 20. There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me." And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him." Last week we began a series of lessons on what is often referred to as the parable of the prodigal son. And having established the literary and cultural context of the passage last time, we're now ready to work our way through the narrative, the principal characters of which are introduced by Jesus in verse 11, a father and his 2 sons. Now, as the drama unfolds, the focus of these 22 verses shifts between these 3 family members. And with each shift, which is to say at the end of each act, there is a reversal of expectation that happens, a surprising turn of events which spins the story in a different direction. Indeed, I think Aristotle would be pleased with Luke's portrayal here, because not only is the drama structured in 3 acts, which Aristotle liked, but it also effectively uses the storytelling device that Aristotle called peripeteia, which means reversal, which is the creating of drama by defying audience assumptions. Now, as the parable opens, the younger son appears to be cast in the role of villain. The first words out of his mouth are, "Father, give me the share of the estate I have coming to me." An impudent command which serves as the catalyst of this narrative. Its design is to commandeer the audience's attention, to grab us by our lapels so that we pay attention. But it's difficult for modern readers to appreciate the effectiveness of this, because we don't feel the full weight of the younger son's insolence. Jewish law permitted a father to determine which assets would go to which sons while he was still alive. But his heirs could not take possession of this inheritance until their father's demise. Thus, to ask one's father for his share of the estate early was to essentially say, "I wish you were already dead." And such blatant insubordination was almost unthinkable in antiquity, because it represented an extraordinary privation of gratitude and appreciation, not just for the father's provision all these years, but for the life-giving resources it took generations of his family to acquire. In traditional cultures, an estate was not considered to be the sole property of the current owner, to use as he saw fit. Rather, patriarchs considered their role more as stewards of the family's legacy, a legacy which had been secured and faithfully passed down by previous generations. Proverbs 13:22 says, "A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children," which is to say, a nobleman does not tend to his land just for the sake of himself or even his children, but for all of his future descendants, and indeed for all of his past ancestors. Which is to say that he thinks generationally. His efforts have as much to do with the past and the future as they do with the present. And thus to exhaust these precious resources upon himself would be considered the very worst kind of infidelity. Indeed, it would be familicide, because it would lead to the destruction of his family. The point being that with the word inheritance comes the notion of responsibility in this text, of being accountable to the past, the present, and the future. Receiving an inheritance from your father meant accepting your role as a guardian of the estate for the preservation of the family's name. Your highest duty was to carry on this legacy that you had been given. And so the ultimate virtue then in the ancient world was, in Roman terms, in Roman language we might say, pietas, which we've talked about before. Pietas is doing one's duty for the good of one's family and community. And again, from a generational point of view. And the great example of this from the classical period that I've used before, but it's just the paradigmatic example, is the figure of Aeneas in Virgil's epic narrative, the Aeneid. For Aeneas, honor and glory is to be found not in giving full vent to his desires, but rather in sublimating them for the good of his community. Thus, the great character arc of the Aeneid is the struggle of the hero to embrace this sense of pietas, to embrace his sense of duty. A life of sacrifice, which he owes not only to the gods, but also to his family, his descendants, and by extension, the future people of Rome. The life of honor in the ancient world was one of self-denial for the sake of one's kinsmen, past, present, and future. A virtue, by the way, we see exemplified in the Apostle Paul, who was even willing to be condemned for the sake of his fellow kinsmen, his fellow Jews, as he declares in Romans chapter 9. And this was an ethic which held sway in the West until very recently. It's interesting, the PBS series Downton Abbey, which I'm sure none of you have seen, portrays in part the sort of final cultural transition from traditional to modern that took place in the early 20th century, when the last vestiges of traditional culture were coming to an end. And in it you see this traditional understanding of stewardship when it comes to an estate. Our modern sense of piety, of course, is very different than this. But here's the point for our text. This central ethic of pietas, of the honor of duty, is utterly lost on the younger son. For as is made clear as the story continues, his duty is to himself alone, which is much closer to the modern ethic. A truth which may even be emphasized by Luke here in verse 12 in the Greek text, because he selects here an unusual word for property or estate. In fact, this is the only place it occurs. And the meaning of it may be that what the prodigal is really asking his father for is just stuff. He just wants the land and the cattle and the servants, that which can be easily liquidated. Which is to say that what he wants is the family's prosperity apart from the family. He wants the patrimony without the patron. He is essentially saying to his father, listen, I've got other plans, and they don't include you. And they don't include this family or this community. Not only do I not want to be a guardian of this estate, I want nothing to do with it. I just want to liquidate it and leave. I just wish you were already dead so that I could just take my inheritance and go. Now notice, and we may come back to this next week, but the son's offense is not just to the father, but it's to the entire community. In fact, it extends to his nation and his God. What this young man wants is autonomy in the absolute sense. He wants a freedom from all restrictions. He has grown to despise conformity and external restraints. He is tired of his dreams and aspirations being dictated to him by others. And so he yearns to be liberated from all such restrictions, whether they be familial restrictions or societal restrictions, or even apparently geographical restrictions, because the text tells us that he plans to flee to a distant country, which is to say that he wants to leave Palestine. He wants to leave the promised land and to take up residence in or among the Gentiles in Gentile land. So what he wants to turn his back upon is not only his family and his friends, but his race or ethnicity and his religion. The Jews were a disciplined people. If you read the Old Testament, that's one of the things that you take away from it. They were a people of covenant, of long-standing traditions. For example, being able to chart one's ancestry back to significant figures in the nation's history was of utmost importance to them. There is a reason why Matthew's gospel, which is likely written to his fellow Jews, why it begins with a genealogy. Something that strikes a modern audience as odd, but it wasn't odd to Jews who were saturated in history and tradition. But Jews were also eschatological, we might say. They looked forward to the prophet's promise of the golden age, when the Messiah King would come and rule over all the nations. And so Jewish identity was deeply rooted in the past, and it was directed and governed by the future. But the young son finds this yoke of identity to be too much of a burden. For he no longer wants to be beholden to the past or to the future. He desires only to live, it seems, in the present, a present which makes no demands upon him. And so he squanders not only the family's fortune, but his greater national inheritance as a member of the chosen race through whom the Messiah would come. And in doing so, he forfeits all of the blessings which accompany that identity of being part of the people of God. For what advantage hath the Jew, Paul asks rhetorically, to which he answers, much in every way, for to him belongs the covenants, and the adoption as sons, and the divine glory, and the temple worship, etc. Rather than being a steward of these immeasurable gifts, the prodigal has chosen to squander them, to waste them, as his name suggests, all for a chance to experience true freedom. And the thing is, many young Christians have followed suit in this. For those who have partaken of the heavenly gift, those who have shared in the Holy Spirit, those who have tasted of the goodness of God's Word and tasted of the powers of the age to come, have exchanged it all for the alluring promise of autonomy. A state of being, mind you, which is illusory. It does not exist. Because not even God is free in the absolute sense. Even the omnipotent is bound by his own nature. Indeed, if you think about it, every act of creation that God has done means a further limitation of his liberty in this absolute sense, in this negative sense. As the creator of the universe, God takes upon himself maximal responsibility. Responsibility as a friend to Abraham, as a bride to the nation, as a ruler to the kingdom. In fact, with each new promise that God makes and has made, In fact, with each new birth, with each new soul that he creates, he becomes less free, more restricted, greater responsibility. And so if the absence of responsibility is the true test of freedom, then God is the most enslaved being in existence. Now, the younger son was not the first to be tempted by this empty promise of limitless liberty. Indeed, it is the lie that gave birth to all of the corruption that we see around us. When you think of the coronavirus, think of this lie and the believing of it. It's when Adam abdicated his responsibility as the ruler of this world, having embraced the fiction that even one mandate, even one rule was too many. I want to read to you a contemporary, and so I'm hoping a more provoking, perhaps, because it's so recent, example of this devastating deception. And it comes from Oscar Wilde's novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. In this section, the hedonist, Lord Henry, is trying to deceive a young man who is not unlike the prodigal into choosing what Soren Kierkegaard called the ascetic life, a life of limitless expression, a life which prioritizes enjoyment. So this is kind of a modern reprisal of the winsome deception that we find in Genesis 3, a version that has Oscar Wilde's evocative prose. Lord Henry says this: "There is no such thing as a good influence, Mr. Gray. All influence is immoral. Why? Because to influence a person is to give him one's own soul. And he does not then think his natural thoughts or burn with his natural passions. His virtues are not real to him then. His sins, if there are such things as sins, are borrowed. He becomes an echo of someone else's music, an actor of a part that has not been written for him. The aim of life is to realize one's nature perfectly. That is what each of us is here for. People are afraid of themselves nowadays. They have forgotten the highest of all duties, the duty that one owes to oneself. Of course they're charitable. They feed the hungry and clothe the beggar, but their own souls starve and are naked. Courage has gone out of our race. Perhaps we never really had it. The terror of society, which is the basis of morals, the terror of God, which is the secret of religion, these are the two things that govern us. And yet, I believe that if one man were to live out his life fully and completely, were to give form to every feeling, expression to every thought, reality to every dream, I believe that the world would gain such a fresh impulse of joy that we would forget all the maladies of medievalism and return to the Hellenic ideal, to something finer, richer than the Hellenic ideal it may be. Now, there's obviously a lot of influence of Friedrich Nietzsche in this character, as well as in Wilde himself. This notion of returning to a Hellenic ideal is very Nietzschean. Nietzscheans sort of saw the world, the good and evil as Nietzsche saw it was the Dionysian world versus the world of Apollo. Apollo represents order and righteousness and goodness, and Dionysus was the god of wine and dance and irrationality and chaos and emotions and instincts. And so the Dionysian gospel of Nietzsche was to say that we should follow, Dionysius and not Christ. Christ was, in Nietzsche's mind, the god of weakness, right? The god who tries to suppress every natural instinct in man. To Nietzsche, the notion of loving your enemies was appalling. It was a denial of life itself, Nietzsche would say. Now, we might respond to that by saying that in a full version of Christianity, it's really a reconciliation between Apollo and Dionysius. I mean, it's a reason and emotion, not just reason or not just emotion. As Jesus says, the true worshipers will worship God in truth and in spirit. But interestingly, both Nietzsche's writings and the picture of Dorian Gray were written during the high moralism of the Victorian era, a time not unlike that of first century Judaism that we talked about last week, when the scribes and Pharisees were the purveyors of dead religion, with souls that were starved and naked, in the words of Lord Henry. Whitewashed tombs full of dead man's bones is how Jesus described it. They were engaging in a lot of good works, but inwardly they were corrupt. It was the same very much in the Victorian era. And thus an appeal to enliven one's spirit by breaking free of the chains of legalism was appealing to the young Mr. Gray. I mean, there is a reason why the West would then enter into the heart-focused romantic period for a time. The question is, however, whether the solution that's offered, a life of maximal sensory pleasure, of indulging every whim and every desire in food and art and music and entertainment and sex, whether that provides the kind of freedom that it promises. Because this is the life that the prodigal chooses, to spend his inheritance on prostitutes and other hedonistic ends. And perhaps it may be that he's doing this in response to the legalism of his elder brother that we will see, or the legalism of his entire community. But the question is, was it worth it? Where does a life like this end? And as it turns out, both in the story of the prodigal and the picture of Dorian Gray, the pursuit of absolute autonomy ends, and as we said, this kind of autonomy is illusory, right? It doesn't actually exist. But if you pursue it anyway, it ends quite paradoxically in absolute tyranny. Specifically in the enslavement in the present, we might say, or enslavement to the present, what we might call the tyranny of the present. As we said, the thinking goes like this: if one is really going to cast off all restraint, then he has to free himself from obligations of the past and the future. His life must not be governed by history or prophecy, but only the immediacy of present experience. But here's the thing, his life is still being governed, right? He can't avoid that. That's why it's illusory. And when the present is severed from the past and the future, it becomes a tyrant. One of the purposes of sensual experience, one of the things it provides us, things like losing ourselves in music and the visual arts, and maybe more contemporary examples are video games and even the habitual scrolling through Instagram. Okay? One of the things that those sensual experiences provide to us is an escape from the pressures of responsibility through a sort of hyper-immediacy where we just sort of become lost in the moment of it. But beyond that sort of respite from responsibility, there is significant value, of course, to be found in experiencing the transcendence of beautiful music and of poetry and of art and of corporate worship, and on and on. It talks about in Scripture of having the veil ripped away so that we might behold the glory of God, the beauty of God, that is revealed to us most fully, of course, in the incarnate Christ, from the texts of Scripture, from the worship that we engage in, and then less fully in the created order, in the beauty that's in the world, and in the beauty that's created by people in art and music, in all the rest of it. That is absolutely essential and foundational, right? That's one side of it. We must be experiencing God and experiencing beauty in that way. If we want to be transformed in our heart, if we want our heart to change, We have to have the veil removed and view beauty in this way. Have these kinds of experiences that come through the body, right? We are a soul and a body. We have an incarnate experience, and so they come to us through the body. So those are absolutely essential. But here's the thing. You can't just have those. Life is made up of more than that. Because the end of man is not in the beholding of beauty, but in being transformed into its image, of then being able to go out and to create more of that beauty and reflect that beauty out in the world. And this is true in our current heaven and earth, the earth that we live on, and it's also going to be true in the new heavens and the new earth. Some people, though, want to stay in some people never want the movie to end, right? You go into a movie, it's a great movie, and you lose yourself in the story, right? The lights come up, the credits roll, and you're disoriented because you've been just utterly lost in the moment of that film. And it can be an amazing experience and a transformative experience, but some people want the movie just to go on forever. They never want it to end. And so the paradigm of aesthetic expression, as we might call it, is the romantic lover who is entirely immersed in his beloved, right? He's lost in a love at first sight experience, which is so overwhelming to him that it demands all of his attention. Everything else just fades into the background. But here's the thing. When you try to sustain that experience, when that's all that life is to you and you try to sustain it, you enter into a downward spiral of diminishing returns that eventuates in total desecration. It ends in total ruin. And so I want to take just a brief moment to try to describe that downward descent. For some of you, you know it, especially if you have struggled with addiction issues. As I describe this, you're going to say, yeah, that's right, I know it intimately. But all of us know it to some extent, right? And by the way, by addiction, I don't just mean addicted to drugs or alcohol. I'm saying being addicted to anything. You can be addicted to art, right? Addicted to these kind of sensual experiences. One of the problems with trying to live in the immediacy of the present is that no matter how ecstatic the experience is, if the source of that experience is finite, right? If your beloved is finite, then eventually the intensity will begin to fade as time moves on. And boredom slowly descends as the memory of past delights and the anticipation of an increasingly repetitive and limited future surface in your conscious mind. Something that we all know from experience is that the anticipation of an event often exceeds the pleasure of the event itself, right? And so the first attempt to try to stave off this boredom, to prevent the past and the future from poisoning that present moment. One of the first things we try to do to prevent that is to extend anticipation. So maybe you're waiting for a decision concerning a college you've applied to. And when the email comes in, you may be tempted to wait a few seconds before you click on it, for numerous reasons. I mean, you might want to wait a few minutes, or if you're really an aesthete, as they would call it, someone after the Ascetic Life, you might wait a few days to try to extend the excitement, right? Because you know once you click on it, the event is often not as good as the anticipation. Another more universal example is the anticipation leading up to Christmas. The joy of Christmas Day is often short-lived, and thus you might hesitate before you run into the living room to see what St. Nicholas has brought you. And the older you get, the more this desire to extend anticipation grows, because you've learned the disappointment of diminishing returns. Or perhaps the experience is muted altogether, because you've learned to better manage your expectations. Some people live a very muted life. They don't want to ride the emotional roller coaster at all, and so they manage, like a Pharisee, their expectations, and everything in their life then is quite muted. But what is also obvious, to add to this, is that anticipation can never be an end in itself. So you want to extend it out forever, right? But it can't be an end in itself. Because the moment one realizes that the event is never going to actually come, all pleasure then in anticipation ceases. It's kind of like when people say, and this drives me nuts, but they say that life is just about the journey. It doesn't matter where, the end doesn't matter. It's just about the journey. But if the end never comes, then the journey becomes meaningless, right? It's just wandering around in the wilderness. The problem with anticipation for the aesthete, for the one who wishes to spend his life lost in the moment of bliss, is that it's too forward-looking. That's why it ruins the present bliss. And so in order to stave off boredom then, and the sense of futility which is going to accompany it, what you have to do is find pleasures which are unexpected, ones that anticipation has not yet ruined, and past experience that past experience won't undermine, right? So it's not something you're anticipating, and it's not something you've ever done before, so that you realize, it's not as good as the last time that I did it. And here's an illustration of this, and with COVID, you can't do this anymore, but I wonder if you've ever had this experience. Have you ever gone to a movie in which you knew nothing about it at all? I mean, you didn't watch a trailer, you didn't read a review, you didn't even see the movie poster, right? You just stumbled into a theater, you knew nothing about it, and then it was just amazing, right? In that experience, it's an event that could not have been undermined by anticipation, right? It's not like you saw the trailer and you said, this is going to be the greatest movie ever, Star Wars Episode 1. This is just going to be insane. And then Jar Jar Binks comes on and he's there the whole movie and you're like, this is the, But I mean, those opening credits start scrolling into the screen in a galaxy far, far away and you're like, this is it. This is going to be the greatest movie ever. And so the anticipation is so great, and then it turns out to be not great, and it's a total letdown. And at the same time, it's not a movie like Star Wars Episode 4 that you've watched 55 times, right? And I don't care what you say on the 56th time, it's not as good as the first time that you saw it. The experience is not the same. You're trying to get the experience again, that's why you're watching it that many times. Or maybe we want to say Pride and Prejudice, right? I have 5 girls who live in my house, so I've seen that movie a few times. So this is where it leaves you. It leaves you. I was going to do a Mr. Darcy impression, but I don't feel it right now, so I'm going to skip it. But this is where, that's my wife laughing the loudest. This is where, this is what I've become. I've become someone that watches Pride and Prejudice all the time. But where it leaves you is you have to find pleasures in that are unexpected, right? Random pleasures. It's like, well, how often is that going to happen? Not very often. And it can lead to some really reckless behavior, right? As you're ignoring your future and you're ignoring the past lessons that you've learned. But here's the thing, with enough money and resources, it's possible to spend years appreciating and collecting art and touring the world and seeking aesthetic delights, especially if you're going after the higher cultural expressions of it. I mean, if you go after drugs, it's going to destroy your body, eat you from the inside out, and it's going to come to an end much more quickly. You're going to run into despair very quickly. And in that sense, maybe drugs is a better option than running around trying to, take in all these other higher cultural expressions of it, because the others can be so much more deceptive. But, it can be enough to sustain a person all the way to the grave, it seems. Some are able to maintain the delusion all the way to the end. And perhaps this is what Paul refers to as a strong delusion in 2 Thessalonians 2. But here's the thing, if the sustaining resources are lost, okay, if the aesthete loses his ability to pursue such refinements, then the vanity of his life is thrust upon him. Because he must now think about the future. And when he thinks about it, it's pretty bleak. Because all of the things that can sustain one when the present is awful, when it's horrible, he has abandoned, right? Family, community, and of course God. In other words, what can awaken one from the spell of this treacherous enchantment is a miserable present, and the forcing of responsibility upon someone by circumstance. And this is what happens to the prodigal when his money runs out. And through an act of God's infinite mercy, a plague devastates his region. So unless he is willing to embrace starvation, he cannot run from responsibility anymore. There is a pressing obligation to feed himself. And to make his present even more miserable, the only job he can secure is to be a ranch hand tending to pigs. And for a son of a Jewish nobleman, let me tell you, this is rock bottom. A pig was an unclean animal for a Jew. In fact, he's not just tending to these pigs. He essentially becomes one of them. He's so hungry that his greatest desire is just to drop down on all fours and eat right alongside them. And I think he's, moments away from just giving up all of his dignity in doing that. This was the most repulsive scenario Jesus could depict for his high-minded audience. But it's where the ascetic life ends, if it's lived long enough, in total desecration. Think about it this way. Just like the aesthete, an animal is a slave to the moment. He doesn't consider the past or the future. He lives only in the moment, in the present. He is a hedonist. He has realized his perfect nature, as Lord Henry would say. Which is to say that the end of the pursuit of autonomy, then, is dehumanization. It is the destruction of the image of God in man, where man loses his exalted state and becomes nothing more than an animal. If you cut yourself off, in other words, from the past and the future, you destroy who you are. You destroy your identity. And the only thing left then are just animal instincts. Now, what saves the prodigal in this moment, just as he's about to jump down on all fours and just give up entirely, just embrace becoming an animal, embrace despair, is a memory of the past, accompanied by a hope for the future. The younger son remembers the goodness of his father, and he is filled with the hope that he might receive him back, even if it's just as a hired hand. So in the pit of Sheol, the prodigal has come to see the value of his father, of his family, of his community, and of his God. Just as Jonah did when he reached the bottom of the sea and he cried out to God for help. And this is what repentance is at its core: a changing of the affections, a despising of what we once loved, and a loving of what we once despised. And the prodigal returns to his father, who embraces him, who runs to him to receive him back and restores him completely. This is a change of heart that Oscar Wilde himself, it seems, experienced. After a life of chasing after aesthetic pleasure, a futile and destructive life of debauchery, on his deathbed, Wilde asked his friend, Robert Clyburn, a revealing question. He said, "Robert, did you ever love any of those boys for their own sake?" These are boys they took advantage of, young men, and used and destroyed. Did you ever love any of those boys for their own sake? Clyburn responded, "No, I suppose not." To which Oscar replied, "Neither did I." The ascetic life is not a life of appreciation and adoration of the beautiful. That's how it's sold, but it isn't. It's a life of consumption and desecration. It's a lonely life where you have no real relationships. You just use people. You treat them as means rather than an end. It's a life of isolation. It's a hellish life. And upon realizing this, Wilde told Robert to bring him a priest. And that very day, the priest took Wilde's good confession. The next day, he died. And if that confession was valid, then he was received by the Father with open arms. The prodigal, again, returning home. Which is a reception that very much violated the expectations of Jesus' audience, the scribes and Pharisees. And that's the next part that we're going to discuss next Sunday.